Good morning, students. This module we will discuss the agrarian social structure of India. The learning objectives of this module are three. The first one is to apprise the students of the agrarian social structure of India. The second is to discuss and elaborate the dynamic interrelationship and overlap between caste and class in this agrarian social structure. And the third part of the module will document and highlight a few changes in the agrarian scenario in India. As we all know, India has been a land of villages. Therefore, a knowledge of the agrarian scenario is imperative for any student of social science. What is the organization of production? What is the division of labor? What is the nature of social structure that underlies the organization of production in the villages is something which is of concern to all social scientists, sociologists, students who are interested in social changes. We go on to discuss this agrarian social structure by drawing from Daniel Thorner's work on agrarian classes. Daniel Thorner was one of the earliest economists who visited India after independence along with his wife Alice Thorner and wrote about agrarian classes in a novel manner. When we talk about agrarian classes, the aim is to describe the network of relations among the various groups who draw their livelihood from the soil. The agrarian structure is, after all, not an external framework within which various classes function, but rather it is the sum total of the ways in which each group operates in relation to the other group. Some of these relations are defined and enforced by law, others are customary. Still others are of a flexible or fluctuating nature. Now, in the agrarian history of India, there have been many efforts to change these relationships by law, efforts which have not been quite successful, efforts which have fallen short of their goals, or efforts which have not had effects which were intended. Now, as far as the agrarian structure is concerned, Daniel Thorner traveled across 75 to 100 villages and found that there were three principal groups whom we can call proprietors, working peasants and laborers, or he used the term Malik, Kisan and Mazdoor. By Malik or proprietor, he referred to a family whose agricultural income is derived primarily, though not solely, from property rights in the soil. That is to say, whatever may be the other sources of income, maybe in the form of a profession or a business, the main agricultural income is derived from a share of the produce of lands belonging to the family. Typically, this share is realized in the form of rent. Usually, the rent is taken in money, but it may be the kind of rent, if the tenants are on a crop sharing basis, they may give a part of their produce also as rent. Instead of renting out his lands, however, a proprietor may hire laborers to cultivate them for him. He may manage these hired laborers himself, or he may even hire someone as a manager. But this particular class of people are termed as Malik if he cultivates with his own hands and he receives an amount for renting, or he gets an amount for having them tilled by hired laborers. Usually the Maliks will enjoy a high type of property right in the soil. He may hold directly under the government, or he may be a superior tenant with rights of occupancy, transfer, mortgage and inheritance protected by law. There is a second class which is known as the Kisan or the working peasant, who also have recognized property interests in the land. They may be small owners, or tenants with varying degrees of security. By and large, their legal and customary rights will be somewhat inferior to those of the Maliks in the same village. The chief distinguishing figure, however, is the amount of land held. In the case of the working Kisan, the size of the holding is such that it supports only a single family and then one or more members of the family, and some family members even perform field labor. Kisans are those villagers who live primarily by their own toil on their own lands. They do not employ labor except briefly in the ploughing or harvest season, nor do they receive rent. The third rural class, that of laborers or mazdoor, comprises those villagers who gain their livelihood primarily from working on other people's lands. Families in this class may indeed have tenancy rights in the soil or even property rights, but the holdings are so small that the income from cultivating them or from renting them outcomes to less than the earnings from field work. Wages may be received in money or in kind. Wages may also be fixed or in the form of sharing of crops. Now, key to the division is the amount of actual labor contributed to the production process and the share in the product. The extent to which income is received despite lack of participation in the agricultural work may well be an index to the severity of the agrarian problem. Going on to something different, under the various pre-British regimes, land revenues collected by the state were simply the state's share of the produce, the right to which was unquestioned. The early British officials assumed that since the state collected what appeared to them as rent, the state must be the owner of all that land. Accordingly, as they took over territorial power from the various rulers, they established the right of the British rule as the supreme or the ultimate landowner. And with this justification, they continued to collect revenues at the former or more commonly enhanced levels. What the British established in India might be described in fact as an imperfect kind of private property in land. To this date, there has not emerged in India a fully developed or pakka private property in agricultural land. It was the British insistence upon the state's prerogative as ultimate owner which has given India's land tenures their distinctive character. So, here we find two levels which need to be understood. One is the fact that the state is the overall owner, supreme owner of land, and at another level you also have some form of private property of land which Maliks own, or small pieces of land which Kisans own. Often, in the case of many social movements, we have seen that there are clashes between these two levels of ownership. Now, socially, the resident Maliks and moneylenders form a small and quite distinctive group within the village. A handful of 6 or a dozen families, they typically belong to Brahmin, Thakur or other high-ranking castes. Alternatively, as in Andhra, they may be members of respectable cultivating castes like the Kammas, Reddys or Raos. They live in larger houses, wear finer clothes, eat a better diet than the rest of the villagers. They may send their children to higher schools, subscribe to newspapers, listen to radios, own bicycles, luxuries, well beyond the compass of the debt-ridden Kisan, to say nothing of the landless Mazdoor log. Now, the Kisans are drawn primarily from cultivating or artisan castes. The Mazdoor log primarily from Harijans, scheduled, depressed or backward classes. Certain types of work locally considered degrading, such as ploughing in eastern Uttar Pradesh, are reserved for these lowly servitors. The rare Chamar, Mahar, Panchama or other untouchables who prospers economically and attempts to secure a foothold for his family by buying land may found insurmountable obstacles in the way of the purchase. For he is up against the deeply entrenched tradition of rural inequality, a tradition which goes back centuries. The belief that the lower caste is born to labor with their hands and higher castes to enjoy the fruits of others' labor is accepted by both the higher castes as well as the lower castes. The separation between proprietorship and physical cultivation both draws sanction from and serves to reinforce the caste structure of rural society. What we have in India today is a unique agrarian structure which represents a blending of the remnants of pre-British economic order, that is, the claim of the state to a share of the produce of the land, together with modern Western concepts of private property. The result has been a layering of rights from those of the state as super landlords or ultimate owner, down through those of the sub landlords to those of the several tiers of tenants. Both the state and the superior holders exercise the right to draw income from the soil in the form of rents. Wherever possible, the tenants also try to subsist by collecting rents from the working cultivators with rights inferior to their own. The maintenance of this hierarchical structure of interests in the land has required, in effect, that quite a substantial proportion of the produce be reserved for persons who perform no agricultural labor. What was left to the actual cultivator after the claims of the superior right owners were satisfied and might still be subject to collection as unpaid debt by the moneylender. Therefore, the Kisan was not left with any surplus to invest in better implements or improved seeds or fertilizers or any incentive to increase his productivity. This broad agrarian structure has been explained and disaggregated further by another sociologist, D.N. Dhanagre, who talked about different categories of landlords within the category of maliks. So, within the category of maliks, Dhanagre mentions that there are big landlords. The big landlords hold rights over large tracts covering several villages. They are absentee landowners, rentiers, with absolutely no interest in land management or improvement. The second category within the maliks, that is rich landowners, are proprietors with considerable holdings who supervise cultivation. They do not perform any field work, but they take a personal interest in the management of land. The Kisans, again within the category of Kisans, working peasants, they have property interest in land, actual interest, and within them also there are small landowners and substantial tenants. Small landowners have holdings sufficient to support a family. Substantial tenants have leases and tenurial rights which are fairly secure and which keep their family above the sufficiency level. Mazdoors are those whose earning is primarily from working, selling their labor on others' lands and plots. They generally do not own land. So, within the category of Mazdoors also there are, again Dhanagre mentions, poor tenants, that means who have tenancy rights but they are less secure, holdings are very small, they are not enough to maintain a family, income is often less than that earned by wage labor. Then the second category is sharecroppers, who are either tenants at will and they have agricultural implements, they cultivate land, they have leases but these leases are not secure, they receive a share of the crop, and then you have landless laborers. Landless laborers, as the category itself denotes, have nothing but their labor to sell. So, therefore, the social composition of these classes in terms of specific status groups, religious or ethnic groups, is far too complex and differs regionally. As mentioned earlier, landlords and rich landowners belong to the upper castes. At the village level, These landowning classes often form a small nucleus. The middle and the poor peasantry, which are mostly debt ridden, came primarily from the traditional castes of cultivators, artisans, and so on. Landless laborers belonged mostly to untouchable castes, the Harijans. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, the great bulk of agricultural workers was recruited from the untouchable Chamar castes, which is one of the most populous caste there. All the same, members of a single caste or religious or tribal community could be found spread vertically, some owning patches of land here and there, others holding tenures, either permanent or year to year leases, and still others working as unattached farm laborers. This vertical spread was more likely to appear in the upper than in the lower castes, although it was not completely absent in the case of some lower castes traditionally engaged in agriculture and craftsmanship. Such a vertical spread often ensured that peasant classes found a developed class awareness hard to come by. Thus, the coexistence of agrarian classes and status group of a non-economic nature is the most fundamental fact about the Indian agrarian social structure that we are discussing here today. The status groups found men by an essentially non-economic sentiment or identity and frequently served to sustain subjugation and exploitation of those in the lower strata of society. In India, these structural linkages and anchorages tended to maintain the status quo to keep the simmering discontent and conflicting class interests within the boiling point and to prevent the struggle for economic and political power from assuming a revolutionary form. But not always. Whenever the exploited sections of a peasantry felt that they were being unjustly treated, deprived, or oppressed, they did erupt and resist whenever conditions were favorable. As a result of which, we have many peasant movements in our country from time to time, from the historical times during the time when the British were here to the most current farmers' movement, which is recently concluded in 2020-2021. Now, I will, when discussing about the changes in the agrarian social structure, which I have just outlined, I would like to mention that though the agrarian social structure may seem apparently fixed, it varies regionally and it is a dynamic structure. Another important thing that we need to reiterate here is that while we are talking of agrarian classes, there is an overlap between caste and class, which makes agrarian class structure in India quite distinctive. So, therefore, the general representation of Indian society as a caste based society is not completely true. The agrarian social structure is a case in point where both caste and class overlap. Now, after independence, there were a few changes which has brought about a concomitant change in the agrarian society and economy. One of the important measures that the government undertook to bring about is to abolish the zamindari system, to create a land ceiling act, and also to bring about land reforms, because it was thought that land reforms would have an impact by creating an interest and investment in land, and which would have the consequence of increasing productivity. These were very far reaching changes, but they were not successful in all parts of the country equally. In states like West Bengal, Kerala, and in Tripura, land reforms were successful. In other parts of the country, they are still ongoing. As a result, we have had peasant movements like the Bhudan movement, which was led by Vinoba Bhave, who travelled across the length and breadth of the country and requested the landowners, big landowners, to grant land to the landless. And because of his charismatic personality, the Bhudan movement was successful in some regions. But after Vinoba Bhave passed away, the land that Vinoba Bhave and subsequently the members of the Bhudan movement managed to collect was not really managed adequately, distributed properly amongst the landless. We also had the Green Revolution in the 1960s, which was undertaken with the intention of bringing about an increase in food security, and it did bring about some kind of an increase, though it had several kinds of impact. One of the impact was to create a division between the big and the small farmers and lead to the consolidation of class structure again in agrarian society. So, one had clear divisions between the middle peasants, the small landowners and the big peasants. This was clear. It is because the Green Revolution required technological inputs which the big farmers could bring together and invest in such technology required for more productivity. So, therefore, Green Revolution was also partially successful. It was not successful in all regions, and the small landowners or even the middle peasants could not really muster up enough resources to take advantage of the scenario brought about by Green Revolution. Dipankar Gupta in more recent times talks about the role of the decline of the village in the imagination of India. India, which was supposed to be considered a land of villages at the time of independence, which meant that a larger proportion of people lived in the village, was no longer so. Villages were changing, villages were diversifying, villages were becoming connected to the city was expanding and eating up the villages. So, there were many changes which were undergoing. People in the villages were not interested in agriculture, or only a section were interested in agriculture. The younger generation was interested in migrating to the city and looking for jobs, though they would have one foot in the village, which leads Dipankar Gupta to talk about whither Indian village, whether it is still an important reality today. However, the importance of the village, the importance of the limits of the city, the importance of agrarian social structure, and the fact that a large section of people are still bound to their lands. Land continues to be a very important marker of social status in rural society. Land continues to be a source of security, a very substantial property that people own. They might not be interested in managing it in the way in which their ancestors might have, but as long as the importance of land continues, agrarian social structure will continue to shape policies or shape the responses of the government, as we just saw recently in the mobilization of different categories of farmers as part of the farmers' movement. Therefore, this module tried to highlight the importance of the agrarian social structure, the existence of agrarian social structure during the pre-British period and in the period after the British left our country, the distinction between different classes, the overlap between caste and class, and finally, the certain trends in the agrarian social structure which would be useful to note for social scientists. Thank you.